Moving on from a couple of decent regiments of renown with Manfred and Ushiran, it's time to take a look at the Nighthaunt regiment, Lady Olynder and her Sorrowmourne Choir, and this one is unfortunately rather lacking, I think, in overall usefulness, especially when you compare it to the other ones, which is a shame to be fair because I do love the Nighthaunt, but let's jump into it, see what you get, what kind of savings, if any, you make points-wise, and the rules that they will be bringing if you do decide to take it. The Sorrowmourne Choir is made up of Lady Olynder, 10 Dreadscythe Harridans, and 2 units of 4 Myrmourn Banshees. It can, like all the other regiments of renown, be taken in any death faction that isn't their base one, so you can bring this along in Soulblight, Ossiarch Bone Reapers, or Flesh Eater Courts, and it will set you back 630 points. Now, whilst that seems cheap, in terms of point saving, it's actually by far the worst of the bunch. Lady Olynder herself is 270 points, 10 Dreadscythe Harridans are 150, and Myrmourn Banshees are 90 for 4, so that is 180 for the two of them. So all in, taking these units separately would actually just cost you 600 points. So you are actually paying more for the pleasure of bringing this regiment of renown, which is really weird to me because the actual regiment rules themselves aren't actually all that great. As I said in my previous video, they do seem quite fun and thematic, but having seen the whole set of rules now, it just doesn't seem very powerful and you seem like you lose more than you gain, so why you have to pay more for the privilege of bringing them just kind of doesn't make sense to me. You essentially just get a form of your regular Nighthaunt rules back, just in my opinion, in a slightly watered down form. The regiment does give you Ethereal back, which is great. You get that 6-up ward save, you get the Nighthaunt retreat and charge, and you get the ability to ignore render modifiers, so that is nice. It would have been pretty tragic if GW had forgotten to put that back in so you didn't have unrenderable saves on these units, but luckily they did. But on top of that Ethereal rule, the only other one they get is their Harvesters of Sorrow rule, which, despite being an awesome Metallica song, just kind of gives you more of the base Nighthaunt rules back and doesn't really add anything additional. What Harvesters of Sorrow does is it means that enemy units can't issue or receive commands in the Battle Shock phase whilst they're within 3 inches of a unit in this regiment, which is practically just your Aura of Death rule from the Battle Tome, where an enemy unit is terrified and can't use Inspiring Presence in that 3-inch range. And then when you charge on an 8+, you get Strike First on a unit in this regiment. So again, this is basically just your Wave of Terror rule, except I would say a little bit of a worse version of it. The main Battle Tome Wave of Terror procs effects on a 4+, and whilst they're not all necessarily as good as Strike First is, I would still rather personally have that -1 to hit debuff on a 4-7, reducing enemy saves on an 8 or 9, and then inflicting Strike Last on a 10+. It's just more likely to get you something because you only need a 4 rather than an 8 to proc anything at all, but also it gives you potentially some additional bonus effects which can stack quite nicely to help debuff an enemy. You know, you can reduce their hit rolls, you can reduce their saves, and those two sort of things together can be much better in terms of overall benefit compared to just having, say, 2 of the units in this regiment fighting first. And what makes that especially apparent is the fact that, aside from the Harridans, nothing in this regiment is especially killy, or certainly not durable enough to really be worthwhile charging in. Nothing here is enough of a threat that I think Strike First will make a huge difference. Banshees, for instance, have 2 damage attacks, but with 4 in a unit, that is still only 8 attacks total, and they hit on 4s, they wound on 3s, so they're still only going to do around 4 damage to an enemy 4+ save unit, even less if the enemy unit does all-out defense, and Olynder isn't that much scarier considering she's a Mortarch. She has 4 Staff of Midnight attacks and 6 Spectral Claw attacks, so there's nothing here like your Great Weapon Graveguard or Morbeg Knights or the Ossiarch Bone Reaper Stalkers, where having fights first would be a really scary threat for your opponent. Everything in this regiment is just okay from a damage output front, so I just don't think the addition of Strike First is enough or has enough of an impact to warrant taking this regiment, especially, as I said, because you are paying more than you normally would by 30 points compared to just running this as a Nighthaunt army. So for me, this one is just a really big miss. The units are okay and fast moving, sure, which could be useful in a death army, and I can see it being possibly useful if you need more magic protection, because the Banshees do bring the Spell Eaters rule, which is really good for giving you some extra durability against enemy spells. But that's about the only reason I can see why you might want to bring this in a Soul Blight or an Ossiarch Bone Reaper or a Flesh Eater Core army, just for that extra layer of magic protection. Olynder does, to her credit, have some token shooting too, but it just really does feel to me that they give up too much in terms of battle traits and don't really get enough back to really warrant taking up a slot in another Death Faction army, in my opinion. Olynder herself procs a lot of stuff which is Nighthaunt specific too, so you lose that as well. Her No Rest for the Wicked will be massively less useful because it still brings back D6 models, but it only affects Nighthaunt, so you're only going to have the 10 Harridans and the 2 units of Banshees to proc it on. Lifting the Veil also feels a tad weaker because you will never get that bonus mortal wound against terrified enemies, because of course there's no Terrify in this Regiment of Renown to hit them with. And even her spell Grief Stricken, it procs +1 to hit for Nighthaunt units, so it won't affect a large part of your army either. Again, it will only affect her, the Harridans, and the Banshees. So I'm just really not sold on this. If there was more of a discount, maybe it was 2 units of 10 Harridans instead of just the 1, I don't know, so you got that bigger discount for bringing it, it would make it much more palatable and give it some much needed hitting power to benefit from some of the buffs you get. But for me, it just lacks too much to really be worthwhile, and I can't see anyone bringing it in another Death Faction list unless, as I said, they really need that movement or the spell protection from the Banshees. So that is Lady Olynder and her Sorrowmourne Choir. As always, I'd love to know what you make of the regiment. Can you see yourself adding it to any of your other death armies, or do you think it is just a little bit too weak to bring? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.